John Ramsey, once seen only as a grieving father, JonBenét, the 6-year-old beauty queen whose tragic death shook the nation. Decades of suspicion, theories, and unanswered questions seemed to bury the truth forever, till a shocking DNA discovery turned the case upside down. What happens when science points to the very man the world thought was a victim? This is the story of how a single test reopened one of America's darkest mysteries. The story of JonBenét Ramsey's case has always been surrounded by shadows that refused to clear. In December 1996, the world woke up to a tragedy that seemed twisted to be real. A 6-year-old beauty queen found lifeless in the basement of her own home in Boulder, Colorado. From the very beginning, the case was steeped in confusion, half-answers, evidence that pulled investigators in different directions. The ransom note discovered in the house was long, unusual, and filled with contradictions. It demanded a strangely specific amount of money, written on paper found inside the Ramsey home. The handwriting was analyzed, disputed, and dissected endlessly. Yet no one could say for certain who wrote it. The lack of forced entry raised more questions. The Ramseys' home had been decorated for the holidays, filled with warmth and glitter. But inside its walls, something sinister had unfolded. The initial investigation was marred by mistakes that would later haunt every attempt to solve the crime. Friends and family were allowed inside the house before it was fully secured. Evidence was handled carelessly, and critical moments slipped away while emotions consumed the scene. When JonBenét was eventually discovered in the basement, wrapped in a white blanket, with a garrote around her neck, the horror of what had taken place became undeniable. Yet the way the case was managed left holes that would never be fully closed. In the months that followed, theories grew wild. Some were convinced the Ramseys knew more than they admitted. Others believed a stranger had entered the house in the dead of night, carried out the crime, and escaped without a trace. Each side built strong arguments, but none could prove their case beyond doubt. The Ramseys became both grieving parents and subjects of suspicion, their every move scrutinized. Under a public microscope, television screens and newspaper covers across America filled with their faces. Analysts dissected the family's behavior, searching for signs of guilt or innocence in every expression and every word. As time moved on, leads dried up, and the mystery began to harden into something immovable. The case remained open, but stagnant. Like a crime frozen in time, police insisted they had not given up. Yet years passed without answers. JonBenét's name remained in the headlines, not because of progress, but because of speculation. Documentaries and endless debates. The crime scene itself became infamous, a symbol of how a single night could fracture not just a family but an entire nation's sense of safety. The idea that the case would never be solved became more and more believable as decades passed. Investigators retired, witnesses aged, and evidence sat sealed in boxes. Each anniversary of JonBenét's death brought fresh discussions, but no new clarity. The world moved on to new crimes, new scandals, yet her case lingered as a ghost in the background of American culture. It was not just another unsolved murder, it was a puzzle that had refused to yield to logic, science, or persistence. People wondered if justice had been buried along with JonBenét. The tragedy had started as a personal nightmare for one family, but it had expanded into a public obsession, a cultural scar. Each detail had been turned over, each clue stretched thin, until the story itself seemed more myth than memory. Still, the hope never fully died. Advances in forensic science offered the possibility that someday, somehow hidden truths might emerge from the fragments left behind. For many, it was the only chance left to give JonBenét the justice she had been denied for so long. Nearly 3 decades after JonBenét's death, the case that had once been considered unsolvable returned to the spotlight. By 2025, forensic science had advanced into realms that investigators in the 1990s could never have imagined. What once required large, clean samples could now be achieved with microscopic fragments of biological material. Laboratories had developed the ability to pull full genetic profiles from a single touch, a brief brush against a surface, or skin cells invisible to the human eye. Old evidence that had been carefully stored away for decades suddenly became valuable again. Sealed envelopes, fibers, and swabs were reopened with new eyes and cutting-edge tools. The Ramsey case, long thought to be frozen in the past, was about to be dragged into the present. Investigators began their work quietly away. From the media storm that had followed every detail of the original investigation, they pulled samples from the garrote, the blanket that had covered JonBenét, and even the tape that had been used. Each piece was treated like treasure, guarded and handled with a precision designed to erase the mistakes of the past. Weeks turned into months as analysts ran and reran tests, trying to separate true profiles from background contamination, knowing the world would scrutinize every result. They used advanced databases to compare findings against millions of DNA samples, searching for a hit that could finally unlock the mystery. For years, skeptics had claimed that DNA testing in the Ramsey case was too limited, too compromised, or too inconclusive to ever provide answers. But science had moved forward. The smallest trace could now tell a story. The team of forensic experts was determined to silence doubts by leaning on methods that had been tested and proven in hundreds of other cold cases. As the process unfolded, early whispers began to circulate among those close to the investigation. Something unusual had been found, something that could not be ignored. Analysts saw a pattern repeating across multiple tests, a genetic profile that matched one person connected to the case. The day the results were confirmed, the atmosphere in the lab shifted. What had been a routine cold case review became headline material in an instant. The DNA profile, drawn from a piece of evidence associated directly with JonBenét's final moments, pointed not to an unknown intruder but to John Ramsey himself. It was not a trace from a shared household object or something explained by ordinary contact. It was located where no innocent explanation seemed possible. Finding was repeated across independent laboratories to ensure accuracy, and each time the outcome was the same. The father who had always claimed innocence now stood at the center of the scientific evidence. When news of the discovery reached investigators, disbelief mixed with unease. For decades, John Ramsey had been viewed through two competing lenses: the grieving parent or the hidden suspect. To many, he had represented the face of resilience, a man determined to defend his family's reputation. To others, he had been a question mark, a shadow that never quite disappeared from the crime. Now, with DNA linking him directly to a critical piece of evidence, the boundaries between theory and fact blurred in shocking fashion. The implications were enormous. If true, the discovery rewrote the narrative of the case, overturning decades of speculation about intruders and strangers. If false, it risked condemning a man who had already carried the weight of suspicion for half his life. The results could not be dismissed, but neither could they be accepted without caution. Investigators were faced with the challenge of presenting their findings to a world that would immediately demand answers. The story of JonBenét Ramsey had just taken a turn no one expected. The ripples of that revelation had only begun to spread. The revelation that John Ramsey's DNA had been found on a critical piece of evidence sent shockwaves that rippled far beyond the walls of the forensic lab. News of the discovery spread like a storm through private investigative circles, government offices, and eventually leaked into the public sphere. For years, people had debated every angle of the case, but the idea that the father himself could be scientifically tied to the crime scene was something no one had truly prepared for. Those who had always believed in the intruder theory felt blindsided, while skeptics who had long suspected the family saw the results as a grim confirmation of their darkest suspicions. The case that had stood still for decades was suddenly alive again, but it carried a weight that threatened to unravel everything once accepted as truth. The impact was immediate and intense. Old interviews of John Ramsey were replayed on television, his calm expressions dissected frame by frame. His words of grief and defense were now overlaid with new suspicion. For many, the DNA discovery blurred the boundary between sorrow and guilt, raising unsettling questions about how much could be hidden behind the image of a grieving father. Theories began to multiply at a dizzying pace. Some suggested that John had staged the entire crime scene to mislead investigators, carefully crafting the ransom note and moving his daughter's body to create confusion. Others argued that his DNA may have ended up on the evidence through innocent contact long before the crime, suggesting the discovery was dramatic but misleading. Inside the investigation, debates grew even fiercer. Detectives revisited every report from 1996, combing through overlooked details that might take on new meaning. The ransom note, once considered a baffling oddity, was now examined in the light of paternal guilt. Could a parent have written something so elaborate, so theatrical, to cover up a crime within the home? The absence of forced entry was another detail that seemed to align with this possibility. If someone inside the family had been responsible, there would have been no need to break in. What had once been dismissed as coincidence now seemed like evidence of something calculated. The community, too, found itself torn apart once again. Some locals who had supported the Ramseys for years felt betrayed, as though their sympathy had been misused. Others resisted the idea entirely, unwilling to accept that a father could be connected to such horror. On talk shows and in online forums, the case became a battlefield of opinion, with every piece of evidence weaponized to support one narrative or the other. The sense of betrayal only deepened because the Ramseys had lived so publicly with their grief, and now the spotlight threatened to recast every moment as performance. The most disturbing consequence of the revelation was the way it reopened old wounds. The Ramsey family had already been subject to decades of suspicion, relentless coverage, and invasive scrutiny. Now, with the DNA link, every surviving family member found themselves dragged back into the glare of public judgment. What had seemed like a closed chapter of their lives was suddenly being torn open again. For John, the man at the center, the discovery threatened to eclipse everything else. He was no longer just the father of a murdered child. He was being framed by science as a potential perpetrator. Yet even with the explosive nature of the findings, cracks began to appear in the certainty of the narrative. Legal experts warned that the DNA evidence, while powerful, could not stand alone. The profile was clear, but the context was muddied. Did it truly prove guilt, or was it an echo of innocent contact that science had captured with too much precision? This tension between absolute proof and possible error kept the case teetering between breakthrough and controversy. What was meant to provide clarity had instead reignited the deepest uncertainties, forcing both investigators and the public to ask themselves whether the discovery was the long-awaited truth or just another layer in the endless maze of this haunting mystery. The discovery of John Ramsey's DNA on the evidence had been hailed as the turning point. But what followed was a descent into confusion and contradiction. Scientists, lawyers, and analysts clashed over the meaning of the results. On one side, there were those who insisted the finding was undeniable. The DNA profile was too distinct, too consistently repeated across different labs to be dismissed. On the other, skeptics raised critical questions about context. Could the sample have been transferred through secondary contact? Could handling the objects during everyday life have left traces that decades later appeared damning when viewed? Through the lens of suspicion, every argument opened a new door. And behind each door was another theory waiting to muddy the waters further. The evidence had seemed clear, but as it was unpacked in courtrooms of public opinion, certainty eroded quickly. Experts who had worked on the case in the late 1990s reminded the world that contamination had always been a threat. The original investigation had been chaotic. The home had not been properly secured. Friends and relatives had walked through key rooms, and officers had moved items before they were processed. Could the DNA connection be less of a revelation and more of an artifact of sloppy handling? This argument struck deeply because the early mistakes of the case were well documented. The discovery was both compelling and fragile, balanced precariously between truth and doubt. Investigators tried to reconstruct the timeline, overlaying the new DNA data with old witness statements. If John's DNA was found in such a specific place, did that mean he had been involved directly in the crime itself? Or simply that his contact had been preserved in a way that now looked incriminating? Theories branched out in every direction. Some proposed that John had acted alone in a moment of rage or panic, later covering his tracks with the elaborate ransom note. Others argued that if the family had been involved, it was a conspiracy of silence, each member playing a role in keeping the truth buried. The scenario shifted constantly, never settling, always resisting a clean conclusion. In the media, the twists were presented with dramatic flair. Headlines screamed of a breakthrough one day, then reported on doubts the next. News outlets brought in forensic specialists to debate in front of cameras. Their professional disagreements turned into primetime spectacle. Each side had compelling evidence. Each side had holes. For the public, the spectacle was both captivating and exhausting. The case that had already been a national obsession was now transforming into a courtroom without walls, where everyone was a juror. But no verdict could ever be reached. The most troubling part was that the discovery did not actually narrow the case, it expanded it. Instead of closing doors, it opened new avenues of suspicion. If John's DNA truly belonged where it was found, then his role in the crime seemed unavoidable. But if the DNA could be explained away as innocent transfer, then the possibility of an intruder remained alive. Even more unsettling, if contamination was the answer, then perhaps none of the evidence could ever be fully trusted. This was not the resolution that people had hoped for. It was another layer of uncertainty stacked on top of decades of confusion. Behind the scenes, law enforcement struggled with strategy. To formally accuse John Ramsey would require more than DNA would require a solid narrative, corroborating evidence, and answers to the many inconsistencies that still lingered. Step back from the findings risked looking incompetent, as though even the advances of modern science could not pierce the fog of this case. Prosecutors weighed the consequences of moving forward without certainty, while defense attorneys prepared for the possibility of dismantling the state's arguments piece by piece. The story of JonBenét's death, once thought to be frozen in time, had been reignited, but instead of clarity, it created chaos. Each revelation sparked another round of questions, and each question deepened the mystery. For those who had waited nearly 30 years for justice, the twists were both hopeful and cruel. They offered the promise of answers only to snatch them away with new doubts. What was supposed to be the solution felt instead like a puzzle that had doubled in complexity, a cruel reminder that even the most advanced tools could not always cut through the shadows of the past. As the years stretched on, the discovery of John Ramsey's DNA on critical evidence became less of a conclusion and more of a haunting question mark. What had first been announced as a breakthrough gradually unraveled into endless debates. Legal experts, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts dissected every angle, searching for a single thread that could tie the narrative together. But instead of closing the book, the DNA connection left the story open, jagged, and unfinished. It stood as proof of something, yet no one could agree on exactly what. For a case already known for its contradictions, the new evidence became just another paradox in a long line of mysteries. The investigators who had once hoped for clarity found themselves trapped in the same web as their predecessors. Each answer created more problems than it solved. If John Ramsey's DNA was where it should not have been, then logic pointed to guilt. Yet guilt required motive, opportunity, and a coherent explanation for every other piece of evidence that had confounded the case since 1996. The ransom note remained a puzzle that did not neatly align with any theory. The lack of forced entry remained both a clue and a conundrum, and the early investigative missteps hung over everything, poisoning trust in any conclusion drawn from contaminated beginnings. The more the case was studied, the more it seemed like justice was slipping further out of reach. For the public, the reopened storm reignited painful divisions. Communities of armchair detectives split into warring camps. Some were certain that the DNA evidence was the long-awaited smoking gun. Others insisted it was a red herring that had distracted from the real killer, who may have walked free for nearly 3 decades. Each anniversary of JonBenét's death brought new documentaries, each promising revelations but delivering more speculation. The story had grown larger than the tragedy itself. It had become a mirror for society's fascination with crime, innocence, and the fragile line between truth and perception. John Ramsey's life in the aftermath of the revelation became its own tragic narrative. He had spent decades defending his family's name, trying to honor his daughter's memory while living under constant suspicion. The DNA link only deepened that shadow. To some, he became the silent figure of guilt, hiding behind grief. To others, he remained a man unfairly tormented by a flawed system and an unforgiving public. His image, once that of a devastated father, now carried the weight of ambiguity. He was both victim and suspect, both grieving parent and accused man. That duality defined him in the eyes of history, regardless of whether the truth was ever proven. The cruelest twist of all was that JonBenét herself seemed to disappear behind the noise. The bright, talented little girl who had once stood on stage in pageants was reduced to a name in headlines, her story rewritten over and over by theories and accusations. Her short life was buried beneath decades of speculation. The DNA discovery, rather than giving her justice, seemed only to deepen the fog around her death. The silence of the basement where she was found still echoed louder than all the debates that followed. In the end, the case without an ending became part of American folklore. It stood alongside the great unsolved mysteries, a story retold across generations without resolution. Science had come close to piercing the darkness, but instead of clarity, it delivered uncertainty dressed as truth. The case of JonBenét Ramsey became less about who had committed the crime and more about how justice itself could fail when overwhelmed by mistakes, media, and time. The final chapter remains unwritten, waiting for a revelation that may never come. Perhaps the truth is locked forever in the walls of that Colorado home, or perhaps it lies hidden in the fragments of evidence still sealed in vaults. Until then, JonBenét's story is less about a solved crime than about the haunting persistence of mystery. Her voice was silenced decades ago, but her case continues to speak, reminding the world that some secrets do not vanish with time, they only grow heavier, pressing down on every attempt to uncover what really happened on that cold December night.